As we begin this session on asking effective questions, I'm going to start by asking you a question. I want you to imagine that we are in a typical Sunday school class. I'm the teacher, and you come into class, and I begin class by asking, why were Jesus' enemies opposed to him? Now, you might think of several answers, and if we were in a class, you might come up with several answers about why Jesus' enemies were opposed to him. Typically, the way this would work is I would take several answers. I might end up by saying, okay, if one of you got close enough, or if it kind of didn't work out well, I might say, well, I was thinking about the fact that his enemies really weren't God's children, because Jesus said in John 8:42, if God were your father, you would love me. Now, maybe you would have gotten that answer, or maybe not. Now, this is an illustration. We'll be coming back to it later, but we all use questions in our lessons as we teach. As I've observed in your classes, I hear teachers asking questions regularly. Your questions are of various types, and they vary in their effectiveness. Sometimes you ask a question, like I did to begin, and either the students don't have a clue what to say, or they say things that are far off the mark. I want to go over some things here that will help you ask questions more effectively. And then we're going to discuss these issues as we get together in our faculty meetings. So first, let's think about, why do we ask questions in class? Well, there's several reasons we might ask questions. First, questions might serve as what can be called an anticipatory set, if you're familiar with Madeline Hunter's direct instruction model. Or we can just think about it as stimulating curiosity. The idea is that we ask questions sometimes at the beginning of a lesson to do something to get the students focused on what we're going to teach, or to get them thinking about the concepts, or to get them curious about it. You see, our students come into class from some other class, which has just dealt with material totally unrelated to what we're going to teach, or they've just spent 4 minutes out in the hall worried about what their best friend thinks about them. They're certainly not mentally prepared to jump right into your lesson, and they need to be brought into your lesson mentally. Asking a question can be a way of doing this. One writer has said, when you ask a question, a thought process begins. Asking a question is a much better way to start a lesson than by saying, everybody get out your science books and turn to page 78. It might be as simple a question as saying, what were the 4 things we learned about King David yesterday? And then you'd follow that up with the next part of the lesson on David. Or it might be, what do you think of when you hear the name Shakespeare? The idea is you're getting the students focused on the topic of the lesson, and also it's bringing to mind things they've learned previously about Shakespeare, to which they can connect new material. But this is one use of questions, to provide an initial focus for the lesson. Questions can also serve as ongoing assessments of learning. So while you're teaching, you want to find out if your teaching is getting through. Are the students grasping what you're teaching? Do they have misunderstandings you need to correct? Have they read the material you assigned? Oral questions can help you determine such things quickly. Questioning can get the students actively involved in the lesson. It's not just a matter now of them sitting and listening to you, but they're having to respond, they're having to get involved. Now, that's if your questions are effective, and we'll be talking about that later on in this session. Sometimes your questions might provoke the students to reflect more deeply on the content or integrate it with previous learning. You might ask a question such as, if slavery as practiced in the antebellum South was unbiblical, why did godly men such as R.L. Dabney defend it? So, you see, we can even see Jesus doing this. In Matthew 16:13, he asked his disciples, whom do men say that the Son of Man is? So this question made the disciples consider all they'd heard about the identity of Jesus. But then the next question he asked, whom do you say that I am? Required them to evaluate what they had heard and come to a personal conclusion. So these questions might help them to develop thinking skills. And so it helps them to develop as you ask them questions. It helps to press them beyond simple answers and think more deeply about the content. Finally, you might ask questions, and one result of questions is that it displays interest in the student's ideas when you ask them properly again. If you're just asking random questions until students happen to hit on the one answer you're looking for, that doesn't show interest in their thinking. But if you take their answers and build on them, even correcting them appropriately, then you're showing that you're really listening to them. Now, there are several types of questions. There are several ways to categorize them. You're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. That's one way of doing it. Bob Marzano has listed several types of questions that are helpful for us to think about. There are comparison questions, such as, how are these things alike? How are they different? What characteristics are alike or different? You might ask questions of classification. Into what groups could you put these things? What are the defining characteristics of a group? Your questions might be inductive. For example, based on these facts, what can you conclude? How likely is it that a particular thing will occur? You might have deductive questions. Based on the rules or principles that we've learned, what can you conclude should happen if we do this, or what predictions can you make? You might ask questions that are error analysis. For example, what are the errors in this writer's reasoning, and how could we correct those errors? Some questions are for constructing support. For example, what argument would support the writer's claim? What are the assumptions of his argument? There are also questions that are dealing with abstracting, such as, what is the general pattern underlying the information you're reading? And there might be questions that deal with analyzing perspectives. For example, why would someone think this viewpoint is good or bad? Or what's an alternative perspective on this topic, and why? Now, one particular classification of questions is convergent versus divergent questions. That is, there are two broad categories, and we can compare these. Okay, convergent questions are the ones that have one right or desired answer. The idea is that the answers converge on one answer. Obviously, this is the way it is in math a lot of times. There's just one answer, one right answer. But in other cases as well, it might be that you're looking for one answer. Divergent questioning, though, can have multiple answers. Maybe you're asking the students, what are examples of such and such a principle? Or how would you apply this scripture verse to your life? Or something like that, where there can be a multiplicity of correct answers or acceptable answers. So that's convergent versus divergent. Now, if we think about Bloom's taxonomy, generally the knowledge and comprehension questions are convergent questions. Knowledge questions, okay, what is such and such, or comprehension. Those types of things tend to be more looking for one right answer. Whereas divergent questions are more on the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy. There could be multiple applications. There might be numerous ways of analyzing something or of synthesizing information. Okay? And then another level of Bloom's taxonomy, evaluation, could actually fall into either category. If we are looking, for example, at ethical questions based on the Bible, then we're going to say our evaluation of something is going to be more convergent. We want the students to see what Scripture teaches about some particular ethical situation. But evaluation could be divergent. You might say, well, what are the interpretations of this poem? Or something like that. Now, I want you to think about the question I asked at the beginning of this session about why Jesus' enemies were opposed to him. See, this is actually a divergent question. There are many possible correct answers. since there were many levels of reasons for opposition to Jesus. But the thing is, what I hear often in Bible studies and Sunday school classes, and sometimes in school classes as well, is that a question like that may be treated as a convergent question. The teacher might be looking for one particular answer, because that answer leads into some other point to be made. And so there can be confusion. You need to think through, am I asking a question that I want to go to one particular focus, or is it more open-ended than that? There's not a right or wrong, it's just that you need to think through what you're asking. And this gets into the next point. The type of questions you ask depends on your particular educational goals. Think about that. What are you trying to accomplish? Bob Marzano says that the types of questions asked in the classroom develop the academic culture of the classroom. A great deal of evidence shows that open-ended essay questions require more analytic thinking than do closed yes-no questions or multiple-choice questions. End of quote. In other words, if you want your students primarily to remember lists of facts or memorize specific items, then you'll be asking questions in Bloom's knowledge level. If you want your class, on the other hand, to be characterized by analytic work and deep thoughts, then you're going to focus on questions from Bloom's 4th, 5th, and 6th levels. And you need both things in class. Okay? Our students must often learn facts and details, and we question them this way. But we also want our students to start thinking worldviewishly and not just be walking hard disk storage units. So we're going to have to ask them questions that get them thinking that way. But think about what you're trying to accomplish educationally and design your questions for it. So now, let's think about some hints for asking effective questions. So again, go back to the question I asked about why Jesus' enemies opposed him. It was an ineffective question in that context because you didn't know the context in which I was asking it. You didn't know where I was heading. Now, if we were in the middle of a study of the Gospel of John and we were studying chapter 8 of John, you would be more likely to know the context of my question, and you could answer that more appropriately because that's what is in John 8. Now, I regularly hear people, like I say, often teaching Bible in Sunday school, ask questions like that, though. The question is so broad and vague that the hearers don't have a clue what the teacher's looking for. So they either don't say anything, or they throw out wild guesses until they happen to hit randomly on the answer the teacher was looking for. You see, research on how the brain operates tells us that we learn new material primarily by relating it to previously learned ideas. And so if we think about asking questions in this context, you need to know the students have to have sufficient background or context to answer the questions. They need to have a context to relate it to. They need to know what previous learning to dredge up. So when I asked about Jesus' enemies, they had various memories about different people who were opposed to Jesus. And they had to try to sort through that in their mind, but they didn't know which context I'm coming from. But like I said, if we were in the middle of a study of the Gospel of John in chapter 8, they would have that context narrowed down for them. So when you ask questions in class, be sure the students know the context or the background for it. Either it's something you've previously taught, or it's something that's common knowledge. But be sure the context is unambiguous. If the context isn't plain, either your students will not answer because they don't know what you're after, or they'll just throw out wild guesses until they happen to hit on what you want. And related to this is the idea that your question should reasonably be answered correctly based on their prior knowledge. So let me give an example. Suppose you're starting a unit in world geography on some country in Central Africa. Your students have had little or no previous teaching on this country. Don't start asking them questions to see what they think might be the main export product of that country, or what type of government it has, or whether the people there are rich or poor. Your students won't have a clue, And they'll either say nothing or they'll guess the wrong answers based on some misconception they have. And students are likely to latch on to wrong answers if they hear them or if they've said them. So you don't want that to happen. However, if you've previously taught about general characteristics of Central African geography and how those features result in particular standards of living, then you could reasonably ask students, now, based on what we've learned, knowing the climate of this part of Africa, what do you think would be the main export of this country? I say that's drawing on previous learning, and it can be effective. It makes them think through what they learned previously. So now next, if you're going to ask effective questions, those that meet your purposes, the questions must be of appropriate difficulty. If your questions are too hard, the students are not going to answer because they just won't know. That's obvious. But you'll find that if your questions are too easy, your students might not answer because they might think you're trying to trick them. So if I were to hold up 2 fingers and ask you, how many fingers am I holding up? You might be reluctant to answer because you think, okay, there's some trick here. He's trying to play on me. Now, as adults, we might not have the same inhibitions as our students do, but our students absolutely fear being made fun of or looking like a fool. So they might not answer. If you ask something like, what's 2 plus 2? Unless you're in kindergarten or first grade, they're going to think, okay, the teacher's got some trick up her sleeve, so they're not going to tell you the answer. Now, an exception might be if you're asking a seemingly simple question in order to get them to think more about it. For example, maybe you're in an art class and the teacher says, what color is this wall? And the teacher might be trying to get you to go beyond just saying blue to being more descriptive, like the shade of blue in the sky in the middle of a hot summer day. Okay. So they're trying to get you to think through. But if all you're looking for is a simple answer, like blue, don't insult the student's intelligence by asking them a question. Generally, they're not going to want to answer it. Next, this is important. You need to allow sufficient time for students to mentally process the question and the answer. Remember what I said about learning involving connections in the brain? Students store information in different networks in their brain depending on how they link information to past learnings. And these places where the information is stored affect the amount of time it takes to retrieve the information later. This is why some students need more time than others to retrieve the same information. But when teachers call on students with the first hands that go up, inadvertently they're signaling to slower retrievers to stop trying to retrieve the information mentally. This is an unfortunate strategy for 2 reasons. First, the slower retrieving students feel that they're not getting teacher recognition, and so it lowers their self-concept. Second, they're not retrieving their information into their working memory, and they miss an opportunity to relearn it. Now, this is from David Sousa's work on the brain and learning. But the thing is, every time a student recalls some piece of information mentally, whether or not he says it, that information becomes better learned. He's brought it into his working memory and processed it. You see, we need to distinguish between rate of learning and rate of recall. These are 2 different mental processes. For example, I tend to learn things quickly myself, but I don't recall them as quickly as others do. When I was in high school, they had invented television back then, but there were 2 televised high school quiz programs in my city. I had the second highest SAT score in my class, and so I was asked to be a student who tried out for our school's team to these programs. One program was a format that required rapid recall. The question was asked, you had to buzz in before someone else did in order to answer, and I failed miserably at that tryout. But the other televised program didn't require speed. You were asked a question, you had 10 seconds to answer. I did very well on that tryout. I was on the TV program and did well for our team on the program. I don't recall information rapidly, but if you give me a few seconds, I can remember it. Our students are the same way. You have some students who learn material quickly and they can recall it quickly. These are usually the ones we call the bright students. You also have students who learn quickly but don't recall as quickly, and sometimes we say these students are underachievers because they're not answering quickly. We just tell them they're being lazy, or we tell them to think harder, whatever that means, or we just go to someone else. Then you have students who learn slowly but tend to recall things quickly, and we label these students overachievers, or they're trying to do things that are too hard for them. They tend to blurt out answers, but they're the wrong answers. Finally, there's students who learn slowly and recall slowly. We tend to label these as slow students and just kind of pass them by. It takes them a while to master something, and even then they have to work for a while to remember what they've learned. So now let's get back to questioning. When you ask a question to your class, if you don't wait before you take an answer, you're only going to hear from the quick recall students. The answer may be right or wrong, but you're not going to hear from the students who take a few seconds to process and recall things. And once you take an answer from one student, the other students quit working mentally. They don't try to continue to recall the information. They don't think about it. They just stop and listen to what the other student says. Instead, you should have appropriate wait time when you ask a question. Studies have shown that when wait time is 5 seconds or more, these things happen. First, the length and quality of student responses is increased. Second, there's greater participation by slower learners. Third, students use more evidence to support inferences. Fourth, there are more higher order responses. But even if you don't wait for 5 seconds, if you wait just a second or two, it still allows more students to process the question and recall the answer. And that results in more students learning the material better. Now, I know there are times when quick recall is the goal. In elementary math classes, you want the students to know their addition and multiplication facts quickly. In foreign language classes, you want them to remember vocabulary words quickly. But work up to that. Okay, drill on vocabulary, but give them a few seconds before you take an answer, and then start shortening the time down. So related to this, though, is the next hint for effective questioning. You see, when you say, "Johnny, what's the chief export of France?" Johnny is the only one who thinks about it. You called his name, the other students mentally shut down. They might hear the question, but they're not really thinking about it because you're not calling on them. So if Johnny gets it wrong, and then you call on Jane, she doesn't begin processing the question until you call on her. Instead, you should ask the question first and then call on a student to answer. So you might say, "What's the chief export of France?" Johnny? In this way, all the students are going to think about it. They'll all recall it and relearn it because they don't know which one you're going to call on. If Johnny doesn't know, Jane will probably know the answer immediately, as will other students. In the same way, don't get in the habit of asking questions or in a pattern by just going down the rows in order or going down your roll in order or something like that. The students will figure this out quickly, and they'll realize they don't have to think until it's their turn. So your goal is not to get the right answer. You know the right answer. Your goal is to get the students thinking about the right answer. So you want to avoid doing things that signal to the students that they can mentally shut down for the time being. So you want to get all your students involved in the questions, but you don't want it to be predictable. You don't want to set up a situation where some students know you're not going to call on them, like you're just going down your roll or going down a row of seats. Call on students randomly. Make sure you call on them all at some point. The idea is to involve all your students, have them all thinking about your questions, because you just might call on them. Another suggestion here, consider asking questions in sequence. That is, don't just ask a question, get an answer, and move on. Follow up that question with another question. and another. You might ask, what happened next? Then next? Then next? Or maybe your first question is broad. Okay, what do we know about whales? Then narrow it down. How do whales take in oxygen? Then more narrow. How do they stay underwater so long? Or you can move from simple to complex questions. So the idea is think of how you can keep building with your questioning technique. Again, remember Jesus did this in the example we've already mentioned, where he asked disciples, who do men say that I am? Then he says, who do you say that I am? Another suggestion, don't mix rhetorical and actual questions. Okay, we tend to ask a lot of rhetorical questions. Again, I pick on Bible teachers, but especially with Bible teachers, they'll ask rhetorical questions as they're talking. They'll say something like this, okay, what do we learn from this parable? Well, we learn 3 main points. And what's the key point? It's that Jesus saves sinners. Yeah, you see, I just asked 2 rhetorical questions. I asked questions, but I wasn't expecting an answer. I asked a question and then gave the answer myself. But then they will throw in a question where they expect an answer. They might say, and how does Jesus save sinners? And then just wait. A lot of times the teacher will get frustrated that no one's answering. Well, the thing is, you've just asked several questions that you didn't want anybody to answer. So how do people know when they're supposed to answer? You need to be sure the students know when they're expected to respond and when they're just supposed to listen. So be careful about asking rhetorical questions. And sometimes this is just an unconscious habit that we have, but you need to be careful about that. Going back to the convergent and divergent questions, if you want one particular answer to a question, you need to ask the question in such a way that it will lead to that answer, or at least it's in some type of context which leads to that answer. And then ask divergent questions in such a way that the students know there's not just one right answer. If you've been asking a series of convergent questions, where there's just one answer, and then you throw in a divergent one, the students are going to tend to stop with the first answer that's given rather than think about other possibilities, because they're in the habit of just giving one answer. So if you're asking a divergent question, you might say, instead of saying, why were Jesus' enemies opposed to him? You might say, what are several reasons Jesus' enemies were opposed to him? So you're giving a clue here that you're looking for several answers. Have students respond to each other's answers, but not predictably. Okay, so one student answers. You say, okay, Johnny. After Johnny answers, okay, Johnny. Now, Billy, can you add to Johnny's answer? Now, don't repeat what Johnny said. You want your children to start listening to each other. And don't do this just when the first student's answer is wrong or incomplete. That's what I mean by saying it's not predictably. You don't want the kids to predict things from your questioning, such as, well, if she's asking Billy, then my answer must have been wrong. Okay, so start getting the students to listening to each other's answers and responding to them. Now, here's the thing that you should start to see. You need to plan your questions ahead of time. What are you going to ask? What will best help the students think about what they're learning? You see, these are generally not things that come right off the top of your head. So you should think ahead. What am I going to ask these students? How can I get them thinking profitably? You want them to do it. You want to ask questions so that all your students are thinking. And when they mentally process it, that helps them learn the material better. So think about this ahead of time. Now, before we have our faculty meeting, I want you to think about a few things. I want you to think of some sample questions that you might ask for your class. And when we meet together, let's talk about it. Think of some convergent questions. Just think of some topic that you're studying in your class. Think, okay, what would be some good questions to get my students to think that are convergent questions that are looking for one answer? Think of some divergent questions. Think ahead about these. And then think of ways that you can ensure all your students are involved in your questioning. And then we'll talk about this when we meet together and can start learning from each other. So, we'll be meeting and talking about this in the next week or so. But if you have questions about things, if you have questions for me, convergent or divergent questions, either one, if you have questions for me, just drop me an email, and I'll look forward to meeting with you soon on this.